We are live at this point, and I can see that people are still joining in. I see the numbers going up. So I see that people are still joining, but in the interest of everyone's time and respecting time, we're going to get started promptly at noon. And my watch says that it is promptly at noon. So we're going to get started. Thank you all for joining us for our webinar today, Divorcing a Narcissist. We have a highly distinguished panel with us. First, I would like to give you some information about our wonderful panelists. We have Michael Magaril, who is a family law attorney in Mountainside, my neighbor. He's right near me in Mountainside. And he has a wealth of awards and designations. He's been designated as a super lawyer many, many times based upon peer recommendations. And his practice is limited to family law. And he really is focused on alternative dispute resolution. And he's going to tell you exactly what that is. But most of you will know that as mediation. And he is also qualified in collaborative divorce. It's important for you to know about Michael that he is trained as a family law mediator, as an economic mediator. And he's also taken additional training so that he can mediate cases that involve issues of domestic violence. So he has a wealth of knowledge about mediation issues, about alternative dispute resolution, and about collaborative divorce, and he's going to share that with you today. Also on our panel, we have Dr. David Gomberg, and Dr. Gomberg is a clinical and forensic psychologist. He's licensed here in New Jersey. He's also licensed in New York, and he has conducted hundreds of custody and parenting time evaluations. He's been appointed by the courts. He's done best interest evaluations, brief focused evaluations, any sort of evaluation that you may need for a custody or parenting time issue, he has done them. He is accepted as an expert in 10 counties, and he's a recognized parenting coordinator in the state of New Jersey. So he has a lot of experience, and he's going to be able to give us a lot of information about what exactly narcissism is. And how you can deal with that in dealing not only with divorce issues, but also in custody and parenting time issues that he may touch on some of those as well. What I will say as a, basically just as a housekeeping matter is we will be taking questions as far as this seminar is concerned or this webinar is concerned. I would ask that you answer or ask any of your questions in the question and answer box, or if you want to put those questions in the chat. And I will make sure that they are directed to the correct panelist. I may not answer your question in real time or may not have the panelist answer your question in real time, but I will make sure that if the question has not been answered by the panelist, that gets thrown to them at the end. So feel free to throw all of your questions at me. Even if we don't answer them right away, I will acknowledge the question and we'll make sure that you get an answer to that question. Also, as a housekeeping matter, we will be sending out information about our panelists, about how to reach them, where they're located, and their bios as far as their information, along with my 10 tips for divorcing a narcissist. I will email that out to anybody who has registered for this webinar. If you do not want to receive an email from me, please let me know that, and I'll make sure that I don't send anything out to you. And that way you'll also have the information for our panelists so that you can reach them if need be as well. Let's see. So we're going to start with Dr. Gomberg. He's going to give you some information about narcissism, about things that you may need to know in that context, and then we'll move on from there. So I'm going to give the floor over to you, Dr. Gomberg.
Oh, thank you very much, Robyn. And, you know, I'm glad that all of you decided to join us on this panel because you're going to hear the most important information you're going to ever hear in your life. When you hear us talking about this, now Robyn said that I could speak for 10 minutes, but I think I'm going to take 25 minutes of our time because I'm the most important speaker on the panel, of course, because I know all the information and I have the information that you all will need to divorce successfully. And by the time you're finished with this, you should all pat yourselves on the back for joining us because you're going to hear the best information and the most perfect information that you've heard all day. Now, I'm sure some of you, now I'm a terrible actor, so you guys probably all figured out that I'm pretending to be a narcissist. I'm a terrible actor. I could never really pull it off. But I want you to sort of get a sense of what you were feeling like anyway while I was talking, because some of you probably wanted to turn this off. Some of you may have started to get angry. Some of you may have started to feel, oh, that's exciting. He knows exactly what he's going to talk about. That I'm going to really listen. So all of those reactions are things you might have actually when you're engaging with a narcissistic person. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, with that, recognizing that feeling and how you deal with that sort of a little later in the panel. I mean, we don't have a huge amount of time. So some of the, kind of get drilled down to sort of the, what is a narcissist is kind of where I think I should start talking about that. So narcissism, the idea of narcissism started out in early psychological theory about an infant developmental psychology. And the infant grows up, is born in a totally narcissistic state. Everything is about the infant. The infant their needs need to be fulfilled. They don't have a sense of any other person or the other person's needs or any of that. They're entirely invested in getting only their needs met, and that's the only thing that's important in an infant's life. So over time, of course, that gets moderated and developed into a more socially appropriate way for most people of dealing with the world and dealing with other people. And you learn over time that those needs can't always be met, and that the disappointment in those needs being met is something that you have to cope with and learn to deal with. For someone who's manifesting narcissistic symptoms, something goes awry in that process, and they don't have the skills, or they lose the skills, or they never develop the skills with which to moderate their need to be the most important, most attended to person in the world.
So can I ask a question, Dr. Gomberg? Does that mean that, and you can tell me if I'm hearing this wrong, does that mean that we're just kind of all born narcissists, but some of us don't manifest those traits and others just kind of hold on to them?
So in psychological developmental theory, the idea is that almost all the traits that we think of as pathological, narcissism and, sort of paranoia or any of these things, we are all elements of all of our personalities to some extent. They all serve a purpose. The narcissism serves a purpose. It serves for you to get your needs met. When you're not getting your needs met as an infant, what do? You cry, you throw a tantrum, you scream, and your caregiver is there to satisfy those needs, right? And so the idea is that, yes, we all have elements of narcissism. It's we need it in order to survive, right? But it's when it becomes pathological, it starts to impact negatively on your ability to live in your relationships with others and on your life. And how that happens is slightly different for different people. But the overall thing is that something goes wrong with the development of that narcissism into a more socially appropriate way. Largely, we think of it as some kind of trauma occurs, actually, that impacts on your ability to manifest proper social, to tamp down that grandiosity, to tamp down that need for attention, to tamp down that need to have others for your self-esteem and your self-concept to be a result of how other people treat you, rather than an internally strong self-concept. So when you're dealing with someone who's got is a narcissist, and I wanted to distinguish between narcissistic behaviors and narcissistic personality disorder, because those are two different things. But when you're dealing with someone with who's manifesting narcissism, all that grandiosity and charmingness and the sort of being the center of attention and drawing people toward them in that way, which all of that stuff is all designed to cover over what really is an underlying sense of vulnerability and weakness. And that's where you are faced in a divorce situation with a very complicated set of circumstances, because now in this situation, the person who's a narcissist is now facing failure. There's no way for the narcissist to get out of the fact that there's a failure happening. And narcissists hate failure. They can't stand it. They can't stand being in a position of failure, feeling like they've done something or that something's happening around them that they can't control. So
my question is, if I may, so how do we actually determine whether someone is a narcissist? I know that as a family law attorney, I will say 99.9% of my clients come in and say to me, my spouse is a narcissist. You have no idea. I don't know if you've heard of narcissism, but let me explain to you, my spouse is a narcissist. I feel like every single one of my cases, all of my clients believe that their spouse is a narcissist. And in my mind, not all of these people can actually be narcissists. So, so how do we actually identify the traits of if this is true narcissism, or maybe if your spouse is just a jerk? I think there's a difference, right?
There's a big difference, yes. So I guess statistically speaking, only 6.2% of the population is diagnosed with with narcissistic personality disorder. Okay, so it's a small, we have a small percentage, right? So if 99% of your divorcees come in and say my spouse is a narcissist, but statistically that's not possible, right? It can't be 99%. So you're talking about that it's probably unlikely that they are manifesting a disorder, right? So I think that it's really important when you're getting divorced. It's one of the highest stress situations that anyone can face, right? So anyone who's on here, or any of the attendees who are getting divorced or want to, are going through that difficult time, the stress of it. And we all know that when we get stressed, our worst traits come out. And so the idea that, you're going to sort of default to a more psychologically vulnerable state and react in that out of that state in response to the stress and the divorce and manifest narcissistic symptoms is pretty high. Like, what am I going to get out of it? How are my needs going to be protected? How am I going to protect myself and get what I deserve in this process, right? Okay, see, so that, so then it becomes really important. As a layperson, it's really hard to spot the differences, I think, between when someone is saying, I deserve this, out of a sense of grandiosity, out of a sense of needing to be, the center of the world, out of a sense of sort of always needing to win, right? Mm-hmm. Those traits would point you in the direction that person is a narcissist, is manifesting narcissistic personality traits, as opposed to, and that those, you'll see that kind of be manifested in an extreme way about everything, about all issues, almost all issues. It's going to be difficult for someone who's got a narcissistic personality disorder, especially, to not push on all issues in that direction. And so when you sit down with your client and you're talking with them about, well, what is, and you get into the nitty-gritty, you'll be able to identify whether or not this pressure is being put on all aspects of the divorce, all decision making, financial, maybe custody and parenting time decisions, where they're going to live, and all of the decisions that have been made up to that point. So whether it's ubiquitous, whether it covers all of everything, or whether it's just kind of focused on specific issues.
So you brought up custody and parenting time, which I know is right in your wheelhouse because you do a lot of those evaluations. So a question I have about that is, if someone is divorcing a narcissist, is that going to have any impact on custody or parenting time? Is that in and of itself, can you say, you know, mom is a narcissist or dad is a narcissist, and as a result of that, that person should get less parenting time, or the custody structure should be different?
As in most things in psychology, the answer is that depends, right? So just because someone has been labeled a narcissist, now labeled by whom? By the wife or the husband, by the friend, their friends, by them reading the internet and looking up the symptoms of narcissism, you know, on the internet, you know, okay. So, or is it really a full-blown, you know, psychiatrically diagnosed syndrome, you know?
So
disorder?
You can have a diagnosis. You can say, my spouse has actually gone to get treatment of some sort and has been diagnosed as a narcissist. That is actually a thing that can happen.
Yes, that is actually a thing. Yes, I mean it's not. That gets into sort of diagnostic categories a little bit too much. I don't want to get into that right here, but yes, there is such a diagnosis, right?
And is there treatment for narcissism?
Yes, yes, there is. There is treatment for narcissism. Again, you know, it's like the old psychology joke. You know, how long does it take, you know, how long does it take a psychologist to change a light bulb? Right? It depends on how much the light bulb wants to change, right? So the fact is that someone who's got narcissistic personality traits, they are some of the most difficult patients to treat. But there is treatment for them, and that kind of directs us into thinking about how you deal with a narcissistic personality, right? Because their goals are to win. Their goals are to avoid seeming weak and vulnerable, because when you expose a narcissist's vulnerability, they're going to react negatively. In psychology, we call it a narcissistic wound. If the person's been exposed, their weaknesses have been exposed in some way, they're going to react. And usually the way that they react is with what we call narcissistic rage. And sometimes that rage can take all kinds of, it can look in, there's a spectrum of how the rage is manifested. Sometimes it's manifested as withdrawal, actually. And so in some ways, you know, like the person says, oh, you know, their vulnerability emerges in a way that it looks like they play the victim, right? Oh, you know, but really underlying that is, I'm really special and I should be treated special, but I'm not being treated special. And so they go into kind of a self-esteem tailspin, so to say, right? And, but sometimes the rage manifests as aggression and hostility and even murderous rage, depending upon how severe the narcissistic personality is.
So how do people protect themselves from that? Like if you're in a situation where you're divorcing someone who is a narcissist, what can you do as far as, you know, making sure that you're not either a victim of this narcissistic rage, or, you know, what kind of steps can you take to try to get yourself to a place where this divorce is just done? I mean, that's what everybody wants ultimately, is for it to be over, right?
Right. So if you're in the divorce process with someone who is manifesting these kinds of symptoms, you're already very familiar with the way this person's is going to react to disappointment, to vulnerabilities, because you've been married to them for however long you've been married to them for, and you have kids, you know, maybe you have kids with them, and so you understand how they're going to react. And so as the lawyer for the person who's, you know, allegedly divorcing a narcissist, you know, you should be asking questions about how this person is going to how this person tends to react to disappointments and all of that, like, and get a clear sense. So some of the, you know, this falls on a very wide spectrum. Narcissism falls on a very wide spectrum. And so the person, you know, maybe the person with narcissistic personality also has comorbid, you know, substance abuse problems. That it's a fairly high percentage of narcissistic personality disorders who also have substance abuse issues. um, or have, you know, other issues that need to be dealt with that interact with how they react to disappointment. And so when you're the lawyer and you're asking the person the questions, well, then you get a sense of, okay, if I deal with this person in an aggressive fashion, or in a demeaning manner, or in how I'm, or go full bore at them about each issue, am I raising the risk that they're going to experience that narcissistic wound and react in a violent, negative way? You want to avoid that at all costs.
So,
Obviously. So I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, so I think so it's interesting because you talk about disappointment and you talk about posture and what kind of posture you should take with this narcissistic person. So I think this is a good place for me to ask Mike some questions as a mediator. So, settlement, when you're trying to bring a case to settlement and you're trying to mediate issues, someone's always going to be disappointed. I mean, that's kind of what mediation is. It's trying to find a balance. So my question to you is, as a mediator, do you take a different position when you know that there is some sort of narcissistic traits present?
Well, that's a good question. And there are always narcissistic traits present, or almost always, because this is a point in life where two people who have been on the same track are now headed in opposite directions. And the number one question anybody has when they're getting divorced is, am I going to be okay when this is over? How do I know how this is going to end? And you are your own major concern, because even if you're putting your kids first, they're not going to be okay. It's like being in an airplane with a problem. You have to put your mask on first. So regardless of where you are, everybody is primarily concerned about what their takeaway from the process is going to be. So, and when we talk about whether it's litigation, arbitration, mediation, or collaborative divorce, there's a range of approaches that you can take.
Can I ask you just to back up a minute, because you threw out a lot of terms just now. Mediation, arbitration, collaborative divorce. For people that are watching that don't know what all that is, can you kind of break that down a little bit? Like what are alternative dispute resolution practices and what maybe collaborative divorce even?
And I think the best way to do that is to put that into context and say, what's wrong with just going to court?
I love court. What are you talking about?
There are some real positives about doing it in court. The first positive is that you get certainty of result, because litigation is compulsory. So the judge at the end of the day is going to rule, and that's the ruling. Yeah. There's also, in terms of process, there's a compulsory aspect to litigation, which means a judge can require people to turn over documents if they're not cooperating, and parties can subpoena banks and other records, and those things are not available in alternative dispute resolution. The negatives, and there are a lot more positives too. If there's a problem before you get to the end of the trail, a judge can say, somebody has to pay for the utilities, there's temporary support issues, et cetera. But there are negatives inherent in litigation that David's pointed out. The first thing is litigation is an adversarial, bilateral, two-sided process that sets everything up for a view of winning versus losing. And for a narcissist, the fear of losing and the compulsion to win can create a situation in which the conflict level rises and there's entrenchment in settlement negotiations. We're told 95+% of all divorces settle before trial. If you are not careful about how you approach conflict and how you approach somebody who is going to react badly to that, you may end up in the other 5%. And it depends on where on the spectrum these narcissistic thoughts and behaviors fall. If they're way over to the other side and somebody literally believes that a judge does not have the right to tell him what to do, I think that sitting down at a table to try to work things out is probably not going to be successful. If you have somebody who is abusive and thinks he's the victim, that often is the case in my office, and we can very often work through that. The other negative about litigation is the expense. It's horrifically expensive, and if the issues are primarily economics, we have to look at this as a business end. So, before I talk about the methods, I want to talk about the approaches, the philosophies. They're essentially nothing is binary. We've got a continuum, just like you have a continuum of narcissistic personalities. We also have a continuum of underlying philosophies and approaches to alternative dispute resolution. And they range from, I like to think of it as a farm. On one side of the farm, there's a field of daisies where everybody sits down and eats granola and sings Kumbaya. That's the popular perception of what mediation and collaborative divorce are. But on the other side of the farm, there's a woodshed. And this process can be more problem solving and emotionally healing, or it can be entitlement based, litigation risk. In other words, if you think you're not paying alimony because you make $400,000 a year and your wife hasn't gone to work in 30 years or your husband hasn't worked in 30 years, you're really not negotiating well. So with recalcitrant participants who have these narcissistic tendencies, to tell them you need to be fair and you need to worry about your ex who's done, soon to be ex who's done so much for you, is a dead end solution. There's not a lot of granola in those kinds of alternative dispute resolutions. What we try to do is, first, we try to keep the parties as separate as possible so that we maintain an equality of bargaining, a negotiating power, and we don't allow the exchange of positions to be used as a mechanism for abuse. The second thing we do is, in speaking to the narcissistic party, we try to set up a boundary of realistic expectations. At that point, the role of the narcissist's attorney is that person is the most important person in that process.
Let me ask you a question, because you brought up something that I wanted to find out anyway. A lot of times when you're doing your mediations, there are not attorneys present. You just get two parties that come in and perhaps want to mediate with you as a private mediator. If there are narcissistic, traits or personality disorder, and you kind of see that, do you think it's possible to engage in mediation without attorneys? Is that still possible to do?
It's all a question of degree, Robyn. But when you're dealing with somebody who is initially inclined, I think, to manipulate the process and to stake out a position, I mean, a lot of these kinds of people will urge mediation because they want to game the system. They want to think it's an opportunity to separate their spouse, who they've been manipulating and abusing for years, from the protections of an attorney, and bring them into a room where we don't need to worry about what the law is. We're going to figure this out by ourselves because I'm a lot smarter than everybody else, and I'll take care of you. And somebody walks out really unable to move forward in life. For serious situations, I can't make an assessment about diagnosed or not diagnosed, but if somebody's got the attitude that the divorce is only about them and what they need, I think that attorneys' involvement in the mediation process at any point is a lot more important than just being informational. The spouses of narcissists, people with personality disorders generally, are at risk of, I always tell people, you should always compromise. You should never, always compromise, never surrender. It's one thing to say, it makes sense to me to take less than I wanted at the beginning. But it's another thing to say, I just can't take this kind of abuse and I'm tired of the fighting. I'm going to give in. Never give in. An attorney is going to be supportive of the non-narcissist spouse, and a good attorney for the narcissist who knows what's going to happen if they go to trial will support a view of some firm boundaries within which we have to create a settlement. Because that attorney, if they're a good lawyer, knows I'm going to try that case and I'm going to get killed if I can't manage the expectations of my client. And I go into a courtroom, I know what the judge is going to do within a certain range, and I'll take my most extreme position for my client, but I'm not going to win what he or she wants me to win. And that results, among other things for that attorney, in an unpaid bill, and an angry client, and a damage to their reputation. More importantly, though, a good lawyer who's concerned about getting the best result for a client is going to understand that in alternative dispute resolution with some creativity, everybody can get a better deal than their worst day in court. And if they can support the mediation process, it's great. If you have somebody who has less experience and ties into and identifies with the narcissistic client, you're going to have two people insisting on an impossible task. And if neither of them can be turned from that, the mediation, the ADR process is going to fail. And how do we get that support is the question, right?
So is there ever a point in the process where you're just looking at it and you're saying, you know what, this isn't working? This is.
Oh, I've done mediation.
Jump ship.
Yes, I've done mediations where I've told the parties that they are presently incapable of reaching agreement because they're not approaching it correctly. But I also find that with narcissistic people, they need time to air their perception of what's going on, how unfair the process is, how much they've been abused. And if you agree with them that I can certainly understand why you are feeling victimized by this. You're the person who went out there and worked and got the money, and now you're giving up half of it, or whatever the issue is. They can, not agreeing with them, but acknowledging their feelings, even though you're not agreeing with them, they can sort of get past that for a while and get down to brass tacks and realize I do have to cut my best deal. Because in alternative dispute resolution, as opposed to this bilateral process of litigation and adversarial approach, the same concession can be recast as a win for the narcissist. The answer is, well, this is the range of the worst possibilities that you're going to face. You're not getting outside of this box. Let's find out how to structure it so that your number one concern gets met. If you don't want to pay alimony, there are ways that we can avoid you paying alimony by simply trading off other assets, those kinds of things. But so the point is that attorneys, I think, are very, very important for people who are in mediation with these kinds of problems. It's really a high conflict divorce situation.
If we have some people watching though that maybe can't afford attorneys, or maybe just don't want to go the route of getting an attorney, but they know that they're dealing with a narcissist. Do you think that mediation is still possible for them?
Mediation is possible. We need to first assess it, okay? So if after a first session, I get a sense that this person, one or both parties, just simply can't be reached, I'll tell them, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I think you're going to need to just have a judge make this decision or try collaborative divorce.
I'm actually glad that you brought up collaborative divorce, because I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I know that you do a lot of that, and I know that Dr. Gomberg, you're involved in collaborative divorce processes as well. So if you're doing it in a collaborative way, Mike, is it helpful to have like a Dr. Gomberg on the team?
Well, it's not only helpful, it's required, at least the way my group practices. So in mediation, a single neutral third party works with two people who negotiate a life plan for themselves after the divorce. In collaborative, it's a little bit different. The goals are still the same, but the point is that each party has an attorney. The attorneys are specially trained in collaborative divorce to try to solve the problems of the parties, and they are committed to settlement. In a formal collaborative divorce situation, everybody signs an agreement that says if the attorneys cannot settle the case, they are disqualified from fighting in court. That's a positive and a negative. The lawyers have the incentive to fight taken away from them, but if it doesn't work out, you have to get a new lawyer and start over. But the most important feature of the collaborative divorce process, as far as I'm concerned for a case like this, is the presence of the divorce coach, the mental health professional. There is support for people in the collaborative divorce process that can be duplicated by bringing that expert into mediation. But in collaborative divorce, they start the process. They are the focal point of the professional team. And they help not only with working out arrangements for parenting, but in a case like this, it's critical for them to give the emotional support to somebody whose issues, emotional issues, are likely to derail the collaborative process and end up with everybody getting a worse deal than they would in court.
So can I ask a question then to you, Dr. Gomberg, about your role in a collaborative process? So are you then supporting not only the narcissist to deal with his issues or her issues? And I say his, and I'm not meaning to be sexist in that, but I know that you did share with me, Dr. Gomberg, that statistically, men are more likely to be narcissists than women. That doesn't mean that there aren't narcissists or narcissistic women. but are you there to support the narcissist to say, like, you need to manage your expectations, and then also supporting the person married to the narcissist in her emotional issues as well? And how are you able to do both?
Right. So that is one of the tricky, it's a good point. It is one of the tricky parts, but yes, I am there to support actually everybody's emotional.
Hopefully the lawyers too, because we'll
exactly, that's right.
Definitely.
The lawyers for sure, because in a situation like this, you want to, as mental health neutral in the collaborative process, you are analyzing and understanding the entire system that is being generated by all the personalities that are involved. So if, sometimes narcissistic people can be very charming and very convincing and and draw people in a way that makes them align with pathological features of the narcissist that they're displaying. So you have to be very careful about how you approach that. And yes, so you're advising, or you're talking to the narcissistic person part of this system, and you're helping them understand that, what limitations might be, but also how to look at the possibilities as wins for them, because that's what they really need to be convinced that when they sign that agreement, that they are gaining something. And sometimes they need to be convinced that they've won. So you have to help frame, and you have to help the attorneys also frame it that way, but you also have to help the other side, the person divorcing the narcissist, that's part of what this person needs. They know it inherently because they've been living with it all this time. This is not a forum or a time that they can now turn the ship. Like the Titanic is moving in one direction, and the divorce process is not the time that Titanic is going to move off course. It's not. Later on, you can start to do that, and in the process, you can start to establish stronger boundaries. You want to make sure that you establish lines of communication that are not abusive and manipulative. So communication starts to become more on email, or through some kind of recorded format, so that you can that everyone knows what everyone's going to be reading, and that there's a record of it. So so these are important features to put in, and you help the person that's divorcing the narcissist to understand that that's part of their process as well, that they're going to have to play their role one more time in some ways, while also establishing boundaries.
So for you, Mike, since you're doing all of these different sorts of processes, you're doing mediation, you'll do arbitration, you do collaborative divorce. If someone is interested in some of these alternative dispute resolution options, what are some tips that you can give them if they know that they're dealing with a narcissist? What are some tips that you can give from a practitioner standpoint of how to kind of make this go smoothly?
Well, the first and most important thing is to maintain your resolve, but to understand that you also need to establish your own limits. What David said is really critical. A divorce is the end of a marriage, but sometimes that divorce process does not end the marital argument. I mean, when I have an argument with my spouse.
That never happens, Mike. What are you talking about?
Well, not since she stopped talking to me now. But when I argue with my wife, the argument's never about what it's about. It's about who's underappreciated in the marriage, who always gets their way, who's not sensitive enough, whatever the relationship issues is. That's the marital argument. And in a narcissistic relationship, I envision somebody who has been subjected to this kind of behavior over the years and has finally had enough and wants it to end. And as David said, don't turn the Titanic now. So very often issues get generated that are not material in terms of the finances and the ability to move forward. Things about furniture and Christmas ornaments and who gets the day after Christmas with the kids. And there's an urge on the part of this person who's finally striking out, usually a woman, for her own independence, to say, I'm not letting him get away with it this time. You have to know what is worth fighting for. And before you go into those negotiations, you also need to do a real hard number crunch on your finances to know what your limits of acceptance are, and work with somebody who's going to really tell you on a cost-benefit basis what the best alternative to a negotiated agreement is when you take into account the risk of that a judge will rule against you and how much it's going to cost. You've got your red line, and you may go a little below it to just for the benefit of getting a settlement, what our judges call the divorce premium. But you have to know when to say no, and you have to know when not to fight. So preparation and professional support is really important in that regard. And uncoupling the emotional issues in the marital argument from the business planning of getting divorced and planning a schedule for children's lives is a very hard thing to do. But that's where the real work comes in for the non-narcissist spouse.
Right. So what I think that I'd like to do, and I do see that there are some questions coming in, feel free to type your questions in and I'll make sure that I ask them before we end this today. But I do know that there are times where we would love for a divorce to settle in mediation or that area, but sometimes it just can't. And sometimes you do end up in litigation. So what I want to share at this particular point are some of my tips for divorcing a narcissist, more from a litigator's perspective. While I do mediations as well, I'm not nearly as good as Mike. And I don't do the number of mediations that he does. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about litigation, because sometimes it ends up there. And one of the things I'm going to give you when this is over are my 10 tips. But I'm going to give you a couple of those tips for divorcing a narcissist. And the first is, if you know that you're going to lead to litigation, if you know that's where it's going, it is really important for you to make a record of everything that's happening. And that's of behaviors, of emails, keep receipts, keep text messages. Because as we've talked about here, the narcissist is always going to want to play the victim. It's always going to be something that you did, or you're the problem. And if you know that litigation is going to happen, the reality is it makes it really tough for a judge if it's just his word versus her word, or his word versus his word, however the configuration is, of what's happening. So if you actually are able to make a record, if you know that you're going to litigation and you can keep all of the evidence that you may have about what's happening, that's going to be really helpful to you. The other thing is, while you're in the process, it's really tempting to try to fight fire with fire. That you're tired of this crap, you have dealt with this for so many years, and I'm not letting this person get away with this anymore. If this person's going to stoop here, I'm going to stoop there. That's what I'm going to do. It's really tempting to do that, but as a litigator, I urge you not to do that. Because then once you do get to court in front of a judge, that makes it really easy for that narcissist to play victim, because they get to say, look at all of the stuff that's happened. Look at the things that this person has done. Look at how I've been victimized. And really, that person's been victimized because you're fighting with their own fire, but they're keeping a record of it. And they're really, really good at making sure that they're able to either tell half the story just about your bad behavior, taking out his or her own bad behavior, and making you look bad to a court. So it's really important to resist that urge to fight fire with fire. I also think it's important to tell your lawyer what's going on. From the very beginning, you should say to your lawyer, this is the type of personality we're dealing with, and that way your lawyer can help you strategize as far as what kind of record to keep, because not everything is important as far as a judge is concerned. And the other thing I think is important is in picking your lawyer. If you go to a lawyer and you're saying, look, this is what I'm dealing with, and the lawyer kind of brushes you off or doesn't believe you or is not on your side, in my view, that's time to get another lawyer. I think you have to get someone who is going to believe you, manage your expectations, of course, and lead you to a place of being reasonable. But that person should believe what you're saying. That person should say, okay, if you're dealing with the narcissist and you've told me these are the personality traits, let's talk about how we deal with those personality traits. The other thing I think is really important is, and Mike, you touched on this, and Dr. Gomberg, you touched on this also, about trying to figure out what your end goal is. What is a win for you? And you can't get bogged down in emotion, because the narcissist is not going to be bogged down in emotion. There's no emotion attached to it from what I've seen. So you have to figure out what your end goal and what a win is for you. And I know from a strategic perspective, sometimes on my end, is if I talk to my client and I know that we're litigating, and a win for them is they want to make sure that they have X amount of time with the children, and everything else they don't really care about. I might make the narcissist party believe that my client cares about things they don't really care about, because in that way I can take those things off the table and let the narcissist get his or her win, and my client still got what it is that's really important to them. So it's important, if you're dealing with the narcissist, in my opinion, to actually figure out what is really important to you. Prioritize the things that are important to you, and don't fight over the small stuff. And the other thing is, I think it's really important to get experts involved. People like Dr. Gomberg. Maybe you need to get your own therapy so that you can try to deal with the issues as well. And if there are children involved, do not involve the children. Do not put them in the middle of this. That's not their place to be. It is not their fault that you're getting divorced, and they shouldn't be made to feel like they have to pick a side. And if your narcissist is making the children pick a side, that's a really good time to get experts involved immediately. If you feel like you're being alienated from the children, get that reunification therapist involved sooner than later. Don't wait until your relationship with your children is irretrievably broken. So those are some tips that I have. At this point, I want to look at some of these questions that we have and see if maybe we can answer some of these questions for you. And if you have more questions, feel free to ask them. So the one question that we have here is, how do you understand when someone really is a narcissist, or the spouse is just saying that their spouse is a narcissist because they're getting divorced? They're trying to paint them in that light. And either, Mike or Dave, either of you can take that one, whichever one wants to field that question.
Mike, you want to go for it? You look like you were going to go for this.
You're chomping at the bit, Mike.
I mean, the only thing I was going to say, and I'll be quick and let somebody who knows what he's talking about talk about it, is I'm less concerned about labels. I'm more concerned about behavior. Mm-hmm. If somebody comes into the divorce process, I don't care if I'm a litigation attorney, a mediator in collaborative divorce, and starts being intransigent and making all sorts of crazy demands and acting like a narcissist. You don't have to be a narcissist to act like one. That's the person I'm going to deal with, not the other way around. So that's the real answer. I don't care who says who's a narcissist or who's at fault for the divorce. I care about how they're engaging in litigation or negotiation to bring this to an end efficiently.
I'll go with that answer exactly. It's basically I was going to say it's about how the person's behaving in the situation, right? So someone comes in and says, "Oh, my husband or wife is a narcissist." You're like, as the attorney, okay, you log that information, well, and you ask, well, how do you see it that way or whatever, and then you see what actually you get when you start to negotiate, when you start to engage with the other side, and you see, well, is this extreme? Is this an extreme? Are they putting down extreme demands? Are they using the process to bolster their own grandiosity or to take revenge on the other party, right? Because that is essentially what the narcissist's goal is. Once the wound occurs and they're in their narcissistic rage, it's all about revenge. It's all about taking it out on the other person. And so you have to judge that. And that's how you're going to know whether or not the person, your client who's making the allegation about narcissism is that real or not. And I would also, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I would also say that it's important to look at the fact that if you have chosen to be married to a narcissist, right, that person is serving a purpose for you. And so you are expressing some need to have those narcissistic traits in your life. And so that has also functioned in the system. And so the person who's married to the narcissist probably also has some deficits that they're dealing with and needing to be sort of addressed as well in the process of the divorce as well. So getting therapy, as you said, is a very important part of that, so that they can see what role they've played in the situation, but also learn coping strategies to deal with their now divorcing spouse.
Right, because when you think about it, if you don't deal with those issues, what's going to end up happening, right? Like you get divorced from this narcissist and you're thinking, great, I'm free. And then you move on to your next relationship maybe with another narcissist, because you haven't dealt with those issues. And now it's
Exactly.
almost like you're back to square one.
And I would say the chances of that are high.
Oh, that's kind of scary. So let's move into our next question. We have a question in your opinions, and I guess this is to all of us. Does the other person dealing with the narcissist often give up too much during the divorce? I'd like to hear from you on that, Mike, just because I feel like you see a lot of both sides of it in doing mediations. Do you feel like the other person kind of just throws up their hands and says, you know what, give him whatever he wants?
This goes back to my earlier comment. Compromise is great and surrender is bad. Where there is an actual imbalance of negotiating authority, or where somebody is overly abused, first of all, one of the jobs of a mediator or an alternative, any professional and alternative dispute resolution, is to make sure that the process is fair. So if it turns out that somebody's being taken advantage of, you have to stop the process. Everybody takes less than they could in a settlement. The question is, is there a gross, unbalanced, unfair agreement developed by the exhaustion of the non-narcissistic party? It is a risk, and that's one of the main concerns that you have as a professional in the ADR process, is to make sure that risk isn't realized. And I started by saying, I love people who come in to mediate their divorces with no lawyers, except in cases like this. I want somebody there to protect and support the non-narcissistic spouse to make sure that doesn't happen.
And I actually know that from my perspective, that kind of goes back to what I was talking about and trying to figure out what's really important to you. Because I know that if I'm dealing with a client, as an attorney-client relationship, not as a neutral mediator, and my client comes to me and says, I'm willing to give up this, this, and this because I want this over. If I already have a list of priorities from the beginning of knowing what's important to that client, if you're taking something off the table that wasn't really that important to you in the first place, I'm going to say go for it. If this is going to get this done and you're going to take that thing off the table and you understand that might feel like a win to your narcissist because they think that you've lost, fine, let's give it up. Where I get a little bit more concerned is if they're giving up something that is very, very important to their ability to live, to move on, to support themselves, to support the children. So for example, if you come to me and you say, I understand that my spouse makes $400,000 a year, that I have not worked a day in my life, I'm not really employable, maybe I have mental health issues, maybe I'm disabled and I'm not able to work, but you know what? I don't want any alimony. Well, that's concerning to me because you're now giving up something that you need to live, that you're not going to be able to support yourself without that thing. So that's not just giving up something to give it up. That's giving up something where I'm going to stop you and say, this is not a good thing for you to give up. Or let's try to figure out a way of how you're going to support yourself if you give up that thing so that the narcissist got his win. So I don't think it's always that the person gives up too much. I think you just have to kind of, again, make a list of priorities of what's worth fighting over.
And that goes back to my earlier comment about hard number crunching when you go in and knowing your limits. Somebody said, I just don't want to argue over this. And if the answer is, well, does that mean that you're willing to sleep in your sister's basement for the rest of your life? When you really start to look at that as a reality, the answer comes up, well, maybe let's go back and try to get a little more.
Right.
I hope that answers that question.
I think so. Do we have any more questions from our attendees? I don't see anything in the question answer box. So if we don't have any more questions, what I'd like to do is maybe just do a quick wrap up, starting first with you, Dr. Gomberg. 60 seconds. If you had something to say to the people out there dealing with narcissists, what would you say?
So I guess it's a matter of trying very hard to understand what the narcissist's needs are and wants and try to satisfy those on a level that is acceptable to you. The thing that we didn't touch on, maybe we'll touch on it again, and I didn't answer a question which is scratching at my mind, is about whether the narcissistic person, does custody get affected by, that? And I think we can talk about that. The answer is maybe. And it depends again on the behaviors that are being manifested by the narcissistic person. And there's all kinds of impacts a narcissistic personality will have on the kids. Some of them are positive and many of them are negative. So we can maybe talk about that some other time. But I think that overall, you as the person divorcing the narcissist needs a support system. You need to have a good attorney. You need to have usually have a therapist, like we said, to help you get through the situation. And you need to learn how to establish appropriate boundaries without instigating further narcissistic wounds in your soon-to-be ex-spouse.
What about you, Mike? Any final thoughts? I feel like this is like at the end of Jerry Springer, where he'll do like his final thoughts. That are always.
Are we supposed to start throwing things?
Yeah, like they're always very poignant. These final thoughts after the entire show with people throwing stuff at each other. But Mike, what about you? Final thoughts for people watching?
My final thoughts are, as the narcissistic person goes further and further to the extreme part of the spectrum, the more difficult it is to get through the divorce. But what we've talked about today is scratching the surface of a deeper topic of complex and high conflict divorces. But what we've talked about is a toolkit. Any one of these methods, approaches, philosophies, litigation mixed with a mediation or process, they can all be used in combination. The timing of the mediation or entering into collaborative is important as well. And every case is very fact specific and has to turn on a real understanding of what the circumstances are. And if you have to pick a mode going forward at the beginning, sometimes you don't have enough developed facts, but you can use litigation in conjunction with mediation. And in fact, if you litigate with somebody like that, you are almost certain to end up in a court-ordered mediation context, right, of which I do a great deal. Or you can circumvent all of that and do collaborative. You can bring collaborative elements into mediation. You can use arbitrators. If you work with professionals who understand the complexities of what the resources are, then you can get your best result with the lowest conflict and the lowest cost. But avoid the temptation to say, this is an impossible person. Constructive engagement will not work, and we have to go out full bore. You may be feeding your anger more than your brain. You got to test the waters and see what they're going to do. The nuclear option is always available. You need to try to avoid that, though, because it's harder to finish up.
And I guess for mine, it's very similar to yours, Mike, which is that even though I am looking at this from a litigation standpoint, I still say to every client I have, no matter who they're dealing with, whether it's a narcissist or not a narcissist, I always say that litigation should be your last option. That should never be option one. Let's litigate. I don't want to try to work anything out. So I do think that a hybrid option makes a lot of sense, but what you do need to do is make sure that you're dealing with the right professionals, that you have somebody who understands what you're dealing with, so that your attorney can tell you the right time to say, maybe we need to switch from mediation to litigation because this isn't working. But you do want somebody who's going to try to get you down that path of a somewhat amicable resolution, because if not, I know that we talk about statistically the fact that that divorces that are litigated and that end in a trial versus divorces that are settled, there tends to be a lot more non-compliance when it doesn't end in an amicable settlement, which means you're just now dealing with your narcissist and post-judgment issues. And I think that is a completely different webinar that I'd like to try to get both of you back for, to try to deal with how do you deal with the post-judgment stuff? How do you deal with the custody issues after you're divorced, where you thought, I'm finally free of this narcissist, but you're continuing to have to deal with this person down the line because of non-compliance, because of issues that continue to come up, and you're finding yourself in court still again and again. So in order to try to avoid that, I still say that it makes a lot of sense to try to come to an amicable resolution and not try the case. But you also need to understand where you're getting to the point where trial is necessary and there's nothing else to do. So at this point, I don't see any additional questions. And I am right on time. This is exactly 1 hour. So we're going to end here. I'd like to thank my panelists, Dr. David Gomberg, Michael Magaril, Esquire. Both of you, thank you so much for being on this panel today. I think it was really helpful and informative. And thank you all for attending. And if we have any additional follow-up webinars, which I think that we're going to, make sure that you attend those as well. And I will send information out to all of you. So thank you so much for attending.
Hey,
Thank
for
you.
having me.
Thank everybody for attending, and thank you very much for putting